Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy, and tonight we're going to talk about the propaganda fog of war, or maybe I should have said the fog of war propaganda.
Yes.
Could be put, but either way. Joining me tonight is the co-host of Around the World with Brandy and Dee, Dee Pierce,
Good evening, everybody. Glad to be
uh,
here.
my very good friend and erstwhile co-host for many of my recent streams, and so
Yes.
I thank her very much for that. Uh, Here tonight, what we're going to talk about is uh, really the dishonesty of the way we're talking about foreign policy, the wars, specifically the war, okay, in Ukraine. Uh, and also perhaps we'll get into some other forms, okay, of dishonesty, okay, as well. Okay, dishonesty is very bad for democracy. Okay, democracy doesn't require complete honesty, but it does require a certain amount of it. It does require that the lying is not completely pervasive and completely outrageous. As we know, Hitler used the big lie to his advantage in Germany. He used it all the time, and it was toxic to democracy there. Stalin also used it, and it was toxic to democracy. Increasingly, in our time, we see the media and governments using the big lie in day to day politics. And again, it is very corrosive to democracy. It was not just introduced by Donald Trump, though he was very effective with it. It has been developing in America for a very long time. If you look at the level of our political debate now and you compare it with the kind of political debate that we enjoyed during the 1960s, even though Richard Nixon was well known to be less than honest and received the well deserved nickname of Tricky Dick, or Tricky Dicky, as some called him. When you go over his speeches and the various things he had to say, uh, except for one or two instances, he was far more honest than many of our politicians today. I hate to give him credit because I disliked him so much. But the fact is, when the time came to freeze wages and prices in 1973, due to the inflation we were having now that he wanted to stop, he was quite honest with the American people when he directly addressed them and explained the reasons why that was a good thing to do. There was a lot of opposition to it, and he showed a lot of courage, okay, in doing that. If he had had similar courage with respect to Watergate, he would have continued as president. But that's off the topic. So let me start here by sharing a piece from Common Dreams about the Ukraine war. And the piece was written by, by Medea Benjamin and her collaborator Nicholas Davies. And it's called How Spin and Lies Fuel a Bloody War of Attrition in Ukraine. And the subtitle, or the short summary: the American people must demand the U.S. political and military leaders tell the truth about this horrific war and our country's role in it. And we must also demand that the media transmit the truth to the public. Because that's the other half of the problem. Our government currently frequently tells lies, and the mainstream media, acting as basically stenographers for the government, simply echo those lies and spread them all around and make the whole nation extremely cynical about the press, okay, and its activities, undercutting support for freedom of the press and undercutting support for free speech and for civil liberties, all of which is very toxic to democracy. In a recent column, the military analyst William Astor wrote, quote, Congressman George Santos is a system of a much larger disease, a lack of honor, a lack of shame in America. Honor, truth, integrity simply don't seem to matter or matter much in America today. And I'll put a little editorial note in here. If they did, Bernie Sanders would be our president today.
Yes, he will.
Continuing, but how do you have a democracy where there is no truth? Unquote. Astor went on to compare America's military and political leaders. Hang on a second, I've got a little block on my screen that I can dispatch in just a second, but it's on my screen, and so I cannot continue until I get rid of it. Oh, there it is. I had a bunch of virus programs exploding on my screen, demanding attention. Antivirus programs, of course, not virus programs. So, Astor went on to compare America's political and military leaders to the disgraced Congressman Santos. Quote, U.S. military leaders appeared before Congress to testify that the Iraq War was being won, Astor wrote. Quote again, they appeared before Congress to testify the Afghan War was being won. They talked of, quote, progress, unquote, of corners being turned, of Iraqi and Afghan forces being successfully trained and ready to assume their duties as U.S. forces withdrew. As events showed, it was all spin, all lies, unquote. Now America is at war again in Ukraine, and the spin continues. I do want to make a comment there. If you ask some people whether America is at war in Ukraine, They will say no. No war has been declared. We don't have American soldiers there uh, in our uniforms fighting at the side of the Ukrainians. And so we are not at war. But the truth is, we are. We are providing all kinds of financial support, all kinds of aid, technicians. They may not be in our uniforms, but they are there. CIA people have been there from the beginning. People from other departments of the United States government have been there from the beginning, from before the beginning of this war, from the time of the overthrow of the legitimately elected Ukraine government in 2014. Our people have been there, and their purpose has been to weaken Russia and work towards dismantling Russia. Actually, parts of our government have been somewhat honest about that. They've talked about it, but they haven't gone to the American people and tried to mobilize the support of the American people in favor of this project. So the elites of the neocons are pursuing a project which most of the American people don't even know about because they haven't been honestly spoken to about it. They've never had a chance to approve it. Congress has never had a chance to approve those war aims. They think they're providing all these weapons and all these support for the sake of freedom so that Ukraine is able to defend itself. But what freedom? Ukraine is a dictatorship. It has no free press. It has no free speech. It has secret police. It has all the marks of a dictatorship right now. So, where is the freedom that we're defending? Where is the freedom whose fight we are contributing to? Further with this article. This war involves Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and its NATO allies. And that's the truth, too. Quote again: no party to this conflict has leveled with its own people to honestly explain what it is fighting for, as I just said, what it really hopes to achieve, and how it plans to achieve it. All sides claim to be fighting for noble causes and insist that it is the other side that refuses to negotiate a peaceful solution. They're all manipulating and lying, and compliant media on all sides trumpet their lies. That's another absolutely true statement. It is a truism that this first casualty of war is the truth, an old saying that. But spinning and lying has real world impacts in a war in which hundreds of thousands of real people are fighting and dying while their homes on both sides of the front lines are reduced to rubble by hundreds of thousands of howitzer shells. To give you a little word on this, the Russians, it is estimated, send 60,000 artillery shells per day against their Ukrainian enemies, while the Ukrainians, in reply, are able to send back only 6,000 artillery shells. Do many Americans know this? Do they know that Russian artillery is 10 times stronger, roughly speaking, than Ukrainian artillery? Eve Smith, the editor of Naked Capitalism, explored this insidious linkage between the information war and the real one in an article titled, quote, "What if Russia won the Ukraine war, but the Western press didn't notice," unquote. He observed, and here I have to interject again, Eve Smith is not a he. Eve Smith is a she. At one time, she used to work as a consultant for the McKinsey Company. But for a very long time, she has been the really wonderful editor of Naked Capitalism. So she observed, if I may correct the article a bit, that Ukraine's total dependence on the supply of weapons and money from its Western allies has given a life of its own to a triumphalist narrative that Ukraine is defeating Russia and will keep scoring victories as long as the West keeps sending it more money and increasingly powerful and deadly weapons. It is not, of course, the truth that Ukraine is defeating Russia. But in our efforts to claim that Ukraine is defeating Russia and to support that narrative, to retain the support of the American people and to retain the support of the people of NATO nations, because we lie about the conclusion of the narrative and the point of the narrative, we have to lie also about key facts. Going on with the article, quote, "But the need to keep recreating the illusion that Ukraine is winning by hyping limited gains on the battlefield has forced Ukraine to keep sacrificing its forces in extremely bloody battles, like its counteroffensive around Kherson and the Russian sieges of Bakhmut and Soledar." Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vershinin, a retired U.S. tank commander, wrote on Harvard's Russia Matters website, quote, "In some ways, Ukraine has no choice but to launch attacks, no matter the human and material cost," unquote. And now to mention something that has been talked about by Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Those counterattacks started out as counterattacks being pursued by 40,000 troops, and then 30,000 troops, and then 20,000 troops, and then 10,000, and then 4,000, and finally 1,000, and then finally less than 1,000. Counterattacks of hundreds of people, but getting smaller and smaller because the cost of those counterattacks, which were not successful for the most part, had such a high human cost among the Ukrainians and their allies. Going on with the article. Objective analyses of the war in Ukraine are hard to come by through the thick fog of war propaganda. But we should pay attention when a series of senior Western military leaders, active and retired, make urgent calls for diplomacy to reopen peace negotiations and warn that prolonging and escalating the war is risking a full-scale war between Russia and the United States that could escalate into nuclear war. General Erich Vodt, who was German Chancellor Angela Merkel's senior military advisor for 7 years, recently spoke to Emma, a German news website. He called the war in Ukraine a war of attrition, quote unquote, and compared it to the First World War and to the Battle of Verdun in particular, in which hundreds of thousands of French and German soldiers were killed with no major gain on either side. Well, as we shall see, that is an inaccurate characterization. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians may have been killed, but hundreds of thousands of Russians have not been killed. That is not true, as we shall see. There have been many lies about that. The latest estimates of how many Russians have been killed from Western sources run as high as 250,000 Russians killed. That, my friend, is absolute fantasy. That as, sorry.
I said the big lie because they want to continue propagandizing the people, and they can suck out more money for the war machine if people think they're winning, even though they're not.
That is absolutely right. And when we say the people, we mean to include ourselves in the people. It is the government lying to us and the mainstream establishment press that is echoing these lies, knowing very well that they are lies, but acting as the stenographers of our government. What does this do to democracy when the press lies down and dies? What does this do to our democracy? What does this do when dissenters who are telling the truth need to be able to tell the truth on social media, and they are swamped by hundreds of thousands of trolls who echo the lies because they've been hired by the political parties, hired by the interest groups, hired by the mainstream press to continue telling the lies. What happens? I'm not continuing to read this article now. These are my opinions. What happens when people live through years of these lies and then they go to the polls and they vote at the polls not knowing the real truth about how the war, is going? What happens when the people in Congress don't know the real truth? Because remember, people in Congress have very limited time, and they need to get news summaries, and they must know what the main establishment sources are saying. And if the main establishment sources are lying, They're getting fed those lies. You and I may have the time to look at alternative sources, to hear alternative voices on social media. But people always trying to raise money for the next election, always trying to meet people who will give them contributions. When do they have any time to seek out the truth? All they can get exposed to is the fog of war propaganda. I'm not sure the Congress people in the rank and file of Congress, if they know what the real truth is. I don't know whether Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, just to take one example, I don't know that she really knows that the Russians haven't suffered 250,000 casualties. I don't know that she really has any sort of valid idea of, I shouldn't say casualties, but killed. I don't know if she has any valid idea of what those real Russian losses are. I don't know that she wouldn't be shocked if she did know what they were. We don't know what the fact basis of our Congress people are. Their staffs are limited compared to the staffs of the executive branch, who construct the narratives the executive branch wants to spread. Anyway, going on. VAD asked the same persistent, unanswered question that the New York Times editorial board asked of President Biden last May. What are the U.S. and NATO's real war aims? Quote, do you want to achieve a willingness to negotiate with the deliveries of the tanks? Do you want to reconquer Donbass or Crimea? Or do you want to defeat Russia completely? Asked General VAD. He concluded, quote, there is no realistic end state definition, and without an overall political and strategic concept, arms deliveries are pure militarism. We have a militarily operational stalemate, which we cannot solve militarily. Incidentally, this is also the opinion of the American Chief of Staff, Mark Milley. He said that Ukraine's military victory is not to be expected, and that negotiations are the only possible way. Anything else is a senseless waste of human life. Unquote. Whenever Western officials are put on the spot by these unanswered questions, they're forced to reply, as Biden did to the Times 8 months ago, that they are sending weapons to help Ukraine defend itself and to put it in a stronger position at the negotiating table. But what would the, quote, stronger position, unquote, look like when Ukrainian forces were advancing towards Kherson in November? NATO officials agreed that the fall of Kherson would give Ukraine an opportunity to reopen negotiations from a position of strength. But when Russia withdrew from Kherson, no negotiations ensued, and both sides are now planning new offensives. The U.S. media keep repeating the narrative that Russia will never negotiate in good faith, and it has hidden from the public the fruitful negotiations. And, by the way, this is very true. A lot of us know it. but the U.S. media keep repeating the narrative that Russia will never negotiate in good faith, and our mainstream establishment, newspapers, television stations, and other media outlets have hidden from the public the fruitful negotiations that began soon after the Russian invasion, specifically in March of 2022. Few outlets repeated the recent revelations from former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett about the ceasefire negotiations between Russia and Ukraine and Turkey that he helped to mediate in March of 2022. The press has kept this secret for a year, the mainstream press, while the alternative press they didn't know about the involvement of Naftali Bennett, but they knew that Turkey had been successful in mediating negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. They knew agreement had been reached.
Hey, Joe, because you and I knew.
We
We
knew
knew back then.
we
We read about
knew
it.
about it back then, but the mainstream press was hiding it. Okay, Naftali Bennett helped to mediate these negotiations in March 2022, and he said explicitly that the West, quote, blocked, unquote, or, quote, stopped, unquote, depending on the translation, the negotiations. Bennett confirmed what has been reported by other sources since April 21st, 2022, when Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu, one of the other mediators, told CNN Turk after a NATO foreign ministers meeting, quote, there are countries within NATO who want the war to continue. They want Russia to become weaker, unquote. Yes, there were such countries. Two of them were the UK and the United States, and there were some others too. But going on with the article, advisors to Prime Minister Zelensky provided the details of Boris Johnson's April 9th visit to Kyiv that were published in Ukrainska Pravda on May 5th. They said Johnson delivered two messages. The first was that Putin and Russia, quote, should be pressured, not negotiated with, unquote. The second was that even if Ukraine completed an agreement with Russia, the, quote, collective West, unquote, who Johnson claimed to represent, would take no part in it. So the agreement could have been had in April of 2022. This is February of 2023. It is nearly a year since the agreement could have been had. Look at all the people who have died during this year needlessly because Boris Johnson and Joe Biden and the neocons on the foreign policy team thought that it was worth the price of all those deaths to weaken Russia. Going on with the article, the Western corporate media has generally only weighed in on these early negotiations to cast doubt on this story or smear any who repeated as Putin apologists despite multiple source confirmation by Ukrainian officials, Turkish diplomats, and now the former Israeli prime minister. So obviously, our government has been lying to us since that time, lying to the corporate media who have been acting as their stenographers. The propaganda campaign, they've been undermining our democracy. That's what they've been doing. The propaganda frame that the Western establishment politicians and media used to explain the Ukraine war to their own publics is a classic, quote, white hats versus black hats narrative, in which Russia's guilt for the invasion doubles as proof of the West's innocence and righteousness. The growing mountain of evidence that the U.S. and its allies share responsibility for many aspects of this crisis is swept under the proverbial carpet, which looks more and more like the little prince's drawing of a boa constrictor that swallowed an elephant. Great image there by Medea and Nicholas. Western media and officials were even more ridiculous when they tried to blame Russia for blowing up its own pipelines. The Nord Stream underwater natural gas pipelines that channeled Russian gas to Germany. According to NATO, the explosions that released 500,000 tons of methane into the atmosphere were, quote, deliberate, reckless, and irresponsible acts of sabotage, unquote. And of course, we know now that they were. And we know now who committed these deliberate, reckless, and irresponsible acts of sabotage. The Washington Post, in what could be considered journalistic malpractice, quoted an anonymous, quote, senior European environmental official, quote, unquote, saying, quote again, no one on the European side of the ocean is thinking this is any other than Russian sabotage, unquote.
Such bullshit.
Yeah, I was going to say my butt, but I thought better of it. It took former New York Times investigative reporter Seymour Hersh to break the silence. He published in a blog post on his own Substack a spectacular whistleblower's account of how U.S. Navy divers teamed up with the Norwegian Navy to plant the explosives under cover of a NATO naval exercise, and how they were detonated by a sophisticated signal from a buoy dropped by a Norwegian surveillance plane. According to Hersh, President Biden took an active role in the plan and amended it to include the use of the signaling buoy so that he could personally dictate the precise timing of the operation 3 months after the explosives were planted. The White House predictably dismissed Hersh's report as utterly false and complete fiction, quote unquote, but has never offered any reasonable explanation for this historic act of environmental terrorism. Notice, by the way, in Seymour Hersh's very long career, going back to the 60s, and he is 85 now, has he ever put forward an utterly false and complete fiction? Never. He is known for multiple sources and cross-checking sources and investigating to the nth degree anything he gets engaged in. He and Chris Hedges are the best reporters of our time. President Eisenhower famously said that only an, quote, alert and knowledgeable citizenry, unquote, can, quote, guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So, what should an alert and knowledgeable American citizenry know about the role our government has played in fomenting the crisis in Ukraine, a role that corporate media has swept under the rug? That is one of the main questions we have tried to answer in our book. That is the book by Medea Benjamin and Nicholas Davies, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. That's the title of the book. The answers include bullet point one: the U.S. broke its promises not to expand NATO into Eastern Europe. In 1997, before Americans had ever heard of Vladimir Putin, 50 former senators, retired military officers, diplomats, and academics wrote to President Clinton to oppose NATO expansion, calling it a policy error of, quote, historic proportions. Elder statesman George Kennan condemned it as, quote, the beginning of a new Cold War. NATO provoked Russia by its own open-ended promise to Ukraine. Sorry, that's another bullet point. NATO provoked Russia by its open-ended promise to Ukraine in 2008 that it would become a member of NATO. William Burns, who was then the U.S. ambassador to Moscow and is now the CIA director, the director who implemented the attack on the pipelines, warned in a State Department memo, quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin, unquote. The U.S. backed a coup in Ukraine in 2014 that installed a government that only half its people recognized as legitimate, causing a disintegration of Ukraine and a civil war between the Donbass and the rest of Ukraine that killed 14,000 people between 2015 and 2020, early 2022. 14,000 people. More, of course, since then. The 2015 Minsk II peace accord achieved a stable ceasefire line and steady reductions in casualties, but Ukraine failed to grant autonomy to Donetsk and Luhansk as agreed in the Minsk II peace accords. Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande now admit that Western leaders only supported Minsk II to buy time for NATO to arm and train Ukraine's military to recover Donbass by force. By the way, in violation of international law and the right of self-determination of peoples, Donetsk and Luhansk, in protest against the fact that Minsk II was never implemented, seceded from Ukraine and held their own elections, their own self-determination elections. They became two republics, the Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk. Anyway, the Western leaders now admit that they only supported Minsk II to buy time for NATO and to arm and train Ukraine's military to recover Donbass by force. So they were planning this between 2015 and 2022. And the United States was involved in arming and training the Ukraine forces. During the week before the invasion, OSCE monitors in Donbass documented a huge escalation in explosions around the ceasefire line. Most of the 4,093 explosions in 4 days were in rebel-held territory, indicating incoming shell fire by Ukrainian government forces. U.S. and UK officials claimed these were, quote, false flag, unquote, attacks, as if Donetsk and Luhansk forces were shelling themselves, just as they later suggested that Russia blew up its own pipelines. After the invasion, instead of supporting Ukraine's efforts to make peace, the United States and United Kingdom blocked or stopped them in their tracks. UK's Boris Johnson said they saw a chance to, quote, press Russia and wanted to make the most of it. And U.S. Defense Secretary Austin said their goal was to, quote, weaken, unquote, Russia. What would an alert and knowledgeable citizenry make of all this? We would carefully condemn Russia for invading Ukraine. But then what? Surely we would also demand that U.S. political and military leaders tell us the truth about this horrific war and our country's role in it, and demand that the media transmit the truth to the public, and, quote, alert and knowledgeable citizenry, unquote, would surely then demand that our government stop fueling this war and instead support immediate peace negotiations. Yes, I think we would. But the point is, the failure to tell the truth about this by our political and our military leaders removed the role of the citizenry, us, in saying yes or no to this. That was an undermining of democracy, and an empowering of democracy right now would be to tell the truth, to start to tell the truth, to admit all that has gone on, to admit that the original war aims were to weaken Russia. Those were the aims all along. The whole plan, including the overthrow of legitimate government of Ukraine, what was that goal? It wasn't to free the citizens of Ukraine. It was to put a hostile power on Russia's doorstep. It was to further a process to weaken Russia. It was to egg Russia on to attack Ukraine, because we knew Russia, William Burns knew Russia would never tolerate our crossing that red line. But we did it anyway. It wasn't an accident. It was over a period of years. It was part of a plan, a grand plan. The grand plan was and is to break up Russia into small nations so that it will never be a great power again. It was about the great chessboard and stopping the evolution of the chessboard to a multipolar setup. It was to stop the multipolarism and its outbreak, to stop a process of history that the people who run this country did not like. I haven't even mentioned here in reading this article, haven't even mentioned that they also hid everything from the German citizenry. Germany was attacked as much as Russia by the explosion of the pipelines. It was an act of war. against Germany that was taken by the United States and that we tried to hide from everybody, and especially the German people, so they could make their own decisions about whether they approved of their chancellor giving consent to this, which evidently he did. There was one more thing I wanted to get into, but remember, keep the main point about this all in mind. The lies and the propaganda and the fog introduced by this has undermined our democratic right to have a voice in whether we go to war or not. We were manipulated. The members of Congress were manipulated. I won't say the leaders were manipulated, but the leaders of Congress surely manipulated the rest of the Congress on behalf of the administration and the deep state to deny us our democratic right to have a voice in this, to decide whether we wanted to get involved in a war in order to weaken Russia and ultimately to break up Russia into a series of smaller states. We never got that chance. The main point is this was undermining democracy rather than empowering democracy. And it was scurrilous, it was dishonest, and it was undemocratic. Now, here are some more lies that I wanted to get into, okay, that are very corrosive. Okay, I want to first share parts of a video that was an aggregation of things that was said by Colonel Douglas Macgregor concerning some of the casualties. Okay, I'm not going to play this all, but I'm trying to get into some of the numbers here to let you see what a lie it is to say that there were 250,000 Russian deaths associated with this. No way in hell that was the case. Why are American sources lying to us about this? This 250,000 figure even got onto Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Program. Even Amy Goodman, to some extent, is a stenographer for our government. But Douglas Macgregor is not. There he was talking about the size of the counterattacks, which I told you about earlier.
to 125,000 killed in action, plus Ukrainians have 35,000 men missing in action and presumed dead. So you're talking about over 150,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed, plus several 100,000 casualties. The hospitals are bursting at the seams with the wounded. So the Ukrainian armed forces are in a lot of trouble. At the same time, the Russians began a series of strikes on every other day,
Okay. 150,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed, most probably killed. Hundreds of thousands of other casualties. So what? 200,000 other casualties, bringing the total up to 350,000, between 350,000 and 450,000. The Ukrainians are running short of soldiers. They're putting in 16-year-olds to fight who don't have adequate training at this point. How many people are hearing this here in America? How much of this is covered by our mainstream press? I'll go a little further into this, then skip to another part of it.
Every 3 days, every 4 days, whatever they thought was necessary. And contrary to what the West seemed to think, or what was at least said publicly, they did not run out of missiles, rockets, and artillery ammunition or anything else.
Yeah, that was something else. Day after day in the mainstream, we were bombarded by how this was going on with the Russians, that was going on with the Russians. Putin had many diseases and he was in trouble, and there were internal problems in Russia. But also, especially, they were going to run out of missiles. They were going to run out of bullets. They were going to run out of artillery shells. When it was the Ukrainian side and ourselves that were having these problems, as far as we know, there are no shortages of any of these things on the Russian side.
They began to systematically reduce the infrastructure in Ukraine that could be used against them. Communications, transportation, ammunition, storage areas, command and control targets, and so forth. Meanwhile, this massive mobilization that you mentioned has been largely completed, although I still continue to get reports of mobilization beyond the 300,000 that is being carried out very quietly, but nevertheless is real. So there are different estimates on how many forces are now arrayed around on the periphery of Ukraine. But we can say with some accuracy, it's over 600,000, probably closer to 650. We don't know how much we should include that sits inside Russia simply in support in terms of transportation, logistical infrastructure. The Russians have definitely committed to total war, or nearly total war. And the Ukrainians at the same time are now essentially being bled to death and at an absolute low point, which is why you see this mad rush in the West to somehow or another make up for the tremendous human and material losses that the Ukrainians have taken. And that's the genesis of these armaments and platform packages that you've been hearing about over the last several weeks. The problem with most of these packages, by the way, if they can get 6,000 to 7,000 rounds out there in response to the Russian army.
Okay, I've now shifted to the middle because he's coming up to a discussion of what the Russian casualties have been that you don't hear about in the American mainstream press, that we're being lied to about.
Firing up to roughly 60,000 rounds a day, and the Ukrainians are lucky if they can get 6,000 to 7,000 rounds out there in response to the Russian artillery attacks. And it looks like about 75% of all the casualties and dead that the Ukrainians have taken to this point are the result of strikes by artillery systems, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, rocket artillery systems. So this is a very grim assessment, and you would hope that someone cared enough about Ukraine to try to find a way to bring this to an end, but the outrageous demands, unrealistic goals from the very beginning that are designed to both humiliate and destroy Russia are simply unattainable. But no one will publicly admit that, least of all Washington. In this recent, I would say, small-scale attack down in Zaporizhia, Russian soldiers reported for the first time that they...
Okay, that's actually Zaporozhye. Okay.
Seeing Ukrainian soldiers throw away their weapons and run. And that wasn't because suddenly Ukrainians are cowards. It's because these are people that just don't have any training. And under the circumstances, what would you expect them to do? They don't particularly care to die. So I think the straits are really dire. Now, you mentioned Russia. We think that there may be between 16 to 25,000 Russian dead.
16 to 25,000 Russian dead. 16 to 25,000. Even if you take the higher figure, that's only 1/6 of the Ukrainian dead. Only 1/6. There are no 250,000 Russian dead. That's a lie. A gross lie. Part of a pattern of lies to persuade us that the Ukrainians are winning this war.
The huge figures that are issued by Kyiv and Washington.
Okay, Kyiv, it said Keith on the screen. Kyiv, of course, is a reference to the government of Ukraine in the capital, Kyiv.
And London and New York are nonsense. The Russians simply have not taken huge casualties. They have perhaps 40 to 50,000 wounded at the most. So this hasn't made much of a dent to the Russian military.
So at the most, 25,000 killed, at the most 50,000 who were wounded, 75,000 casualties. What did we say for the Ukrainians? 450,000 casualties. Why do I believe Doug Macgregor? I believe him because he's sourcing things from a whole range of sources. Colonel Macgregor.
Oh.
He's sourcing things from a whole range of sources that come over the internet, and he's carefully, along with others, aggregating and counter-checking the statistics. Where do the newspapers, the establishment papers, get their figures from? They get them from a single source, okay, at the Pentagon, who has an interest in supporting the narrative that the war is going well due to the heroism of the Ukrainian people.
By any stretch of the imagination, and many of those who were wounded a few months ago are returned to duty. And of course, that's part and parcel for the way this entire campaign is being fought from day one. Ukraine is winning. Ukraine is winning. The Russians are losing. The Russians are losing. The Russians are dying. The Ukrainians are winning. It's all nonsense. It's never been the case. And the losses are horrific. And we've reached this strategic inflection point where there have to be some decisions made as to whether or not this continues until Ukraine is destroyed or something else happens.
Puritan's Pride high-quality vitamins and supplements have been helping people reach their health goals for almost...
Okay, that's enough to make my points. There have been big lies that we are being told about the relative casualties on both sides that we are being asked to swallow, and that is supporting a larger narrative that justifies our country spending so much money on supporting Ukraine, on keeping the war going, on failing to negotiate with the Russians because we are trying to weaken and hurt the Russians, and because we're trying to implement a plan that keeps us as the hegemon of the world. These neocons are playing the great game on the chessboard of the world. That is what they care about. They don't care about the people who live on that particular chessboard. They don't care about what happens to us. They care about winning the great game, okay, on the chessboard. Okay, that is what I wanted to say. Uh, I'm going to turn it over to you for comments now, Dee.
Okay, yes, it was very good to actually hear because, like, I've been I mostly listen to foreign sources with stuff, and I read and I do a lot of investigative work on stuff. And we've known this where the US is concerned. We look at with Vietnam, with getting into Vietnam. We look at what happened in Iraq, being sold weapons of mass destruction, and then being sold. Then we saw what happened with Abu Ghraib, and we've seen lies over and over again. This time is no different than any other time, and it's the people, as you said, they don't care about the people on the ground. They don't care about the lives that are lost. If there was a sense of humanity and caring about the lives, this would have never started or it would have been ended. But the people that are profiting are the people on top. You have Wall Street, people that are invested in the different stocks are making a killing. They're doing great. And the Ukrainian people and the Russian people, they're the ones that are suffering with all this. They didn't ask for this. But it's just about, like you said, the hegemony. Anytime any country starts getting too powerful, somebody's too powerful, they have to be taken down. Because the US wants that unipolar world where it is number one, and it will continue destroying countries to assure its number one status.
Yes, I entirely agree. That is the game being played now by the U.S., and it will be the game being played until, at least until we have a new administration, and maybe beyond that. But if it's to be changed in this particular administration, then it has to be changed by Joe Biden. And the way it can be changed is if he replaces his whole foreign policy team with new foreign policy makers. The Hillary Clinton cretins have to go. Jake Sullivan, but Tony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, their other advisors from the private sector, the people now running our foreign policy, have to be replaced with people who accept the idea of a multipolar world and who accept the idea that there will be other powerful nations, other superpowers. We're not talking about only Russia here. We're talking about the emergence of China, of course, which is not to be denied by us. The emergence of India, okay, and Brazil. There are what, 230 million people in Brazil right now? A land rich in resources and human ingenuity. They're going to be a great power whether we like it or not. Their resources are comparable to Russia's in many ways, and their population is currently 80 million people in excess of Russia. We're not going to stop the Brazilians from emerging and becoming a great power themselves. We ought to encourage them and we ought to welcome them. And we ought to welcome the Chinese and the Indians too. We need to have a collaborative foreign policy that delivers as much as possible justice to all the peoples of the world. That's going to be difficult because, as I've said before in this program, multipolar systems can be dangerous for the inhabitants. Most people have forgotten or have never knew that during the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, and a good part of the 20th century, the world was run by multipolar systems with a number of great powers. In systems like that, wars can start, powerless nations can be victimized, lots of injustices can be done. So evolving to a multipolar system is not going to be easy. It's not going to be a picnic. It's not going to bring utopia or paradise to any of us. It's going to be very hard to manage the transition and very hard to keep the whole thing peaceful. But my point is, we do not have a choice. That is the world we currently live in. It is foolish and fruitless and unrealistic to try to hold back the tide. We need to enter the multipolar system with a good heart and good intentions for everybody. We need to change the reputation of the United States. We need to practice ethics and honesty and truth, both here internally and in our international practices, as well. We need to learn to become a good citizen of the multipolar system. And so that also is my message for tonight. I want to go over the comments now from our friends. Kay says, hi, Joe and Dee. And you said, hi, Kay. Kay says, propaganda on anything is not good. Kay says, however, I back the Ukraine. Okay. And Lana says, happy Valentine's Day, everyone. And Dee says, happy Valentine's Day, Lana. Lana says, I don't back Ukraine or Russia. I know that we, the U.S. and NATO, have been setting this up for years, and I wish we would support and push peace talks more than promote war, but peace doesn't make bucks. Well, actually, we used to think that peace with China was making bucks. I mean, we were reveling in the good business we were doing with China. I mean, our rich people were getting richer. Our oligarchs were getting richer and more powerful. They loved the trade with China. They didn't want to promote a war with China until recently. So, my point is sometimes peace does produce dollars. It does make bucks. Kay says, happy hearts and flowers, Lana. And Lana says, thanks, ATWWBAD, which I confess I can't make sense of that acronym.
Brandy and D.
I'm sorry.
Around the world with Brandy and D.
Oh, around the world with Brandy and D. Cool.
Yeah, instead of having to spell it all out.
ATWWBAD. All right. ATWWBAD. Okay, I'll try to memorize it for the future. Lana says, thanks, Kay. And Kay says, you win, honey. I think the YW, honey. You win, honey. Okay. Okay, and that's the only other comment we have. So everybody, thank you for coming. We again didn't have a 10 o'clock show tonight. but from Greg or Kayla, as he sometimes would like to be called. Hopefully, we will have one tomorrow.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
That would be wonderful. And hopefully, Brandy will be with us tomorrow. But I'm pretty sure that Madeline and I and Dee will be here at 8 p.m. tomorrow.
Around the world with Brandy and Dee.
Yeah, ATWWBAD. and at 9 p.m., I will have another the Dump the Corruption show dealing with the fundraising of 3 more CPC congresspeople. And we will continue to explore whether there is even one CPC member who can pass the litmus test.
We're still fishing.
We're still fishing. We're trying.
Yes.
We're trying to catch a fish. We're still fishing. So thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks for staying this long. It is a little late, 10:18. Have a great night tonight and a great day tomorrow until we see you again.
And don't forget, if you haven't liked, shared, and subscribed to Joe Firestone, please do that right now.
All right.
We need to get his subscriptions up.
And if you haven't liked, share, and subscribe over at ATWWBAD, please do so there, okay, as well. And so I'm going to say good night. I'd like you to stay for a minute more or 2 minutes more. Dee, I want to ask you something.
Okay.